Well, welcome to week one. Um, as I, because the previous lecture was, as I said in the welcome lecture for a previous class, but it had covered so much of the uh, ethos and the material that is so important for this term, this class, that I decided to put it up for you to have a general introduction to the whole thing. What I'm going to do with this lecture is go through, as I do in most lectures, is go through the text. However, I am leaving out kind of the middle part of the first chapter that goes through each specific environmental issue, from oil use to fracking to chemicals in the air to ozone layers, all of that. You need to read that, however, because that's what will give you a really grounded understanding of why people's hair is on fire about this issue, and what it might mean for your future. And I know it's dense and I know it's statistics and I understand all of that, but it's really, really important. Be sure and look at all the figures, and I'll mention them sometimes when I'm lecturing here, which ones are really crucial for you to look at. But all of them are, because they lay it out in a different form than reading. You'll see it in a table form or a graph or chart form. So that's important. Uh, Now, I want to open with this quote that's in your book, which I think is pretty powerful, and it says, uh, "Because it is people who create environmental problems, it is people who must solve them." And that is really a powerful statement. Okay, the animals didn't create the problems, the trees didn't create the problems. The air itself did not create the problems, except one can make an exception to that when a volcano blows or something of that nature, then yes. I remember the Mount St. Helens thing here, and the ash we had clear down here when that happened from that. So occasionally, it isn't people, but 99.9% of the time, it's the people that create the problems, not. And one could say also, now I think about it, hurricanes and that type of thing. So there's enough problems of that 1% that nature creates, that for heaven's sake, we don't need to add to that with the things that we make happen that actually cause things like hurricanes to be worse, right? Have always been hurricanes. Now we have an increase in things of that nature and tornadoes. So you get my point. So this text, if you haven't taken sociology before, if you have, some of these concepts will be familiar to you. If you haven't, they're probably new to you. And the first and most important one for this whole discussion is what's called the sociological imagination. And the definition of the sociological imagination, it's not exactly this way in this text, it's from a Soc text, I'm going to give it to you, is seeing the relationship between individual experiences and larger social influences. So that's something that's an important thing to get, because we are a very individualistic society. We're the most individualistic society in the world. That's our ideology. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. If something's going wrong in your life, it's your fault. A sociologist looks at the whole picture. What forces, what social forces, economic forces, political forces, educational, religious, family, health system forces are impacting you? Okay. Is an individual, as a demographic for race, gender, class, that type of thing, age, all of those things. So when you start looking at things that way, then you get a much bigger perspective on how your moment in history, what's going on. Look at what's going on in Ukraine right now. A month or less ago, they were just living their lives like we are, right? Working, going out to eat, playing with their kids. Bang, it's gone. It's changed. Is that impacting their realities? Of course it is. So that's is it their fault? No. It's larger social forces that are impacting them. So that's an example. So what, on a larger sense, what this refers to is the people's actions and attitudes in the context of the social forces that shape them. So to understand, you need to understand it to both understand yourself and other people's realities. So it's how our personal stories relate to the broader conditions of our society, and vice versa, as I just said, how the broader conditions of society relate to our personal stories. And when you do this, then you see how forces greater than yourselves maybe are at play, causing certain things, or certainly setting up the conditions for certain things to occur. And it isn't just you. So let me give you an example about the sociological perspective. I do this in all my classes, or sociology classes, if you've had them. So how do most people look at a homeless person? Well, there's a variety of reactions, panhandling. They're bums, they're drug addicts, they're alcoholics, I love the urban legend that they're actually making a lot of money doing it. They could get a job if they wanted to. They're lazy. I can't think of any more right now, but there's plenty of them. So how does a sociologist look at a homeless person? And I've asked my students, to do this occasionally to just change the way your head thinks. A sociologist goes like this. I wonder what brought that person to that street corner at this time in their life. What were the circumstances that led to that? That's the sociological imagination. It doesn't involve judgment. It involves deeper thinking, right? Deeper critical thinking about what larger forces impacted. Go back to when this person panhandling was a little kid. Okay, abusive family, uh, addict parents, being removed from the home, lousy schools, being bullied. I mean, you could go on and on and on with larger social forces, poverty, that type of thing. PTSD is huge, right? A lot of those people on the streets are ex-military, as we know. A lot of them are women with children. That's when the growing homeless. That's about domestic violence. Well, what led to domestic violence? So that's the sociological imagination. Okay. Now, so what is environmental sociology? It's the study of the community in the largest possible sense, the community of all, of everything. And that involves other people, animals, the land, water, air. They're all closely connected and they all interrelate with each other. And they form a kind of togetherness, a community, right? None of them can exist without the other, certainly not optimally, and often not at all when species die or, glaciers melt, that type of thing. So environmental studies, the community of all, with an eye to understanding the origins and then proposing solutions to the problems that we're facing right now environmentally. So another key point about environmental sociology is, may surprise you, but it's one of the major themes in environmental sociology today, modern, and that's justice and inequality. Because these problems don't affect people equally, as you will see, okay? And that's one of the important things to look at as well in the charts and graphs in your text. You'll see the inequalities. If you're very wealthy, you can, to a certain extent, protect yourself from some of this. At least you can get access to health care if you get cancer, right? At least you can have access to healthy food, which helps protect you from some of the things that are consequences of environmental degradation. So what is the issue here is that the effects of environmental problems aren't distributed equally across human and non-human populations, but inequality is deeply involved in causing them. Okay, and you'll see how that is in a minute. So inequality is both a producer of climate change, pollution, overconsumption, resource depletion, habitat loss, we could go on and on and on, but it also influences how we understand or define those problems. It can also influence how we think about nature, how we envision nature itself. Because, and here's the deal, inequality shapes our experiences, which shapes our knowledge. For example, there is a movement in inner city schools, which are often predominantly Black, not always, and people of color, children of color, to get them out to take them outside of the city. And there's some very moving, if I can find some video, I'll put it up, of kids who've never seen the countryside. They've never seen nature. Their whole lived experience to the time they were born is in concrete. Okay? That also has to do with doing community gardens in those communities. Uh, Many kids, and I was with Head Start for many years, many years ago. Many of those kids don't even don't understand that food grows in the ground. Okay, it just comes from a store somewhere. So, can you see then how the inequality of kids who don't have those experiences of nature or growing things or knowing that they grow or whatever shapes the experiences, and that shapes our knowledge or lack of. Okay. So, what is the question of community here? It is a question of community. If we're thinking about benefiting a whole, a community of every critter, thing, person, and non-living things as well, snow and ice and rain and air, that type of thing, then you have to understand inequality from the viewpoint of justice. So it's not a just community if there is a lot of inequality happening. So what this is, sociology as a discipline is the study of human communities, okay? But environmental sociology is the study of both the social and the ecological, okay? So you put not just humans, but the whole ball of wax together that is the planet, that is the earth, and look at it that way, all the different forms. Now, this next section in the book is called Joining the Dialogue. So dialogue is discussion, right? Dialogue is an exchange of ideas, of words, that type of thing. So there are 3 parts in the book that help us join the dialogue, okay? The first is looking at the material. So the discussion about environmental sociology, its causes and solutions, involves 3 different components of the dialogue. The first is the material. The material is the health, the consumption, the economy, science, technology, development, population figures, that shape environmental conditions. Okay? It's all of those material aspects that you can see and, that type of thing. The ideal is the next component of the dialogue. And that's how our cultural ideology doesn't mean ideal like the best or perfect. It's based on ideas. So it's the culture, the ideology of the culture, our symbols, right? The our moral values. Boy, okay, and this and our social relations that influence the way we think about and act toward the environment. If we think about the environment as exclusively put here for us to use. That's the only reason it's here. That's an ideology that's very, very different. You're going to behave differently, right? Than if you have an ideology or a thought or a belief that we're all in it together, meaning all species, everything, the whole planet, we're in it together. It's not just for our use, right? It's a give and take process. The practical is the third one. So we have so far the material, which is all the components of society and, economics, production, development, all those things we mentioned, the healthcare system, how much we consume of everything, the ideal, how we think about these things, about nature. And then the last one is what's the practical? What can we actually do, really? How do we create a just ecological society? And that means through governance, right? Through mobilizing different aspects of the community into action. And it's the politics of our everyday lives. And when I read that in the chapter, what I reminded me of was in the 60s, politics is personal was a statement. Okay. And that had to do with all kinds of things, boycotting the grapes when Cesar Chavez was, trying to get improved conditions for the grape producers in California. And many, many, many of us boycotted grapes, even though we loved them, for a year or more, right? Not buying certain products is a political act, There are other ways, of course, that the politics are personal, but that's an example. Okay, so it's impossible to separate those three things: the material, the ideal, I think ideology is a better way to put it, but anyway, the material, the ideal, and the practical. We'll stick with your book's terminology. You cannot separate them at all. So another aspect of this that the book wants you to know that it's going to be coming up through all the chapters. It's a theme throughout the book. These are several of them. It's the central importance, once again, of inequality and questions of justice in talking about environmental problems. The dialogue, okay, the interactive and unfinished character of this ongoing dialogue that we have of environmental issues, and the interplay of the material and ideal factors that we talked about a minute ago. The value of understanding social and ecological dynamics as a form of community. If we could begin to think that we live in our micro communities of our families. It gets a little bigger if we think about the social connections in our employment or in our friends and that type of thing. And the biggest level of it is this earth, right? That community, a social and economic. If we think about operating in terms of a social and ecological community, then that's very helpful to dealing with these problems. And the value of understanding those dynamics as a form of community. This is another one that's really important. The powerful influence of political institutions and commitments on environmental practices. Okay, folks, I hate to say that over and over. It ain't going to happen without very large institutionalized programs. It also isn't going to happen without all of us doing our part. But those large programs, fines for people who pollute, for an example, look at what happened with leaded and non-leaded gas. That was a governmental legal thing that changed everything, right? So those are, I know people tend to freak out about the idea of politics being involved with this, but it's real political institutions. But it in a large society, that's all you've got to make large change. Okay, and that's one of the functions of government, is to protect people, right? To make things better. not worse. So think about it that way. That's one of the functions of taxes, to do that. Okay. So what's the other one? Oh, the other thing that's really important is to, in part of this dialogue, is to think about the very many possibilities and the demonstrated successes. I just did leaded and unleaded gasoline for you. There have been many successes of things that have really helped to resolve some of the conflicts. And we know many more solutions and fixes. It's just that politically, it's very hard to get them enacted in many cases. But they're there. They're there. The solutions are there, many of them. So the other thing here that the book, the next section it's talking about, the heading is the ecology of dialogue. And that's the long-standing debate that's gone on forever about the relationship between the environment and society. And there's two viewpoints, primarily, if you break it down, into large components: the materialist and the idealist. Now, once again, idealist does not mean it's ideal or perfect. It means it's a way, an ideology, a way of thinking about something. So, oh my God, just a minute, excuse me. So, the materialist refers to the actual material conditions of life, like it sounds like. And it's what they're saying is that you can't understand environmental problems apart from the material threats created by the way we organize society. So that those environmental threats come out of the material ways we organize our society. Gasoline powered cars. Okay. Fracking. Those are all the material ways we organize the things we need or we think we need to survive or to function or to flourish, right? They're material things. The idealists think about the role of ideas and what is best and highest ultimately, right? They recognize that there's no ideal thing, but ultimately you start from that kind of perspective of, so they don't necessarily disagree with the materialists, but they emphasize the influence of social life, those ideas about things, okay? About how we conceptualize the problems of, in this case, the environment, which we're speaking about. So it kind of focuses on, excuse me, the ideological origins of environmental problems, right? Definitions. How do we define something as a problem and something that's a non-problem? This is where that conflicted dialogue comes in, right? Some of us see certain things as a problem. I mean, a problem that's really a crisis, and others don't see it that way at all. So that's what idealists kind of focus on, is how do we get those ideas? Where do they come from? And how do they influence us and affect what we can do? So this example that I just give is some of us see things as problems and some of us don't. A materialist says climate change is a dangerous result of how we organize the economics of social life, which is true to a great extent. It really, really, really is. The oil companies don't want to give up drilling oil, right? Which is why we still use gas in cars, okay? The idealist, on the other hand, with the situation, you want to recognize the existence, or even if you want to see the danger of climate change, or even that it exists, you have to view the problem through the social relations. And there's going to have an example here. Okay. So you go back to the materialist now saying, okay, it's about basically how we set up our economics, right? So what you need then would be land use laws, fracking laws, drilling laws, technologies encouraging the use of alternative energy, that type of thing. Okay, that's how a materialist would approach this. An idealist would say, yeah, well, that's all well and good, and you need to do that. But the first step has to be to understand our environmental ideologies. So let me give you an example of that. Let's take the Native Americans that were here and the colonizers and settlers that came. Okay. Man, those colonizers and settlers thought that the Native Americans were pretty stupid, right? Because they did not use the land the way the the Europeans were used to using land. They didn't own it, right? They didn't put fences up. They didn't farm it. All this land of the whole United States, from sea to shining sea, was being wasted in the perception of the settlers. Well, if people aren't even smart enough to use the land, and you can pretty much accuse them of anything, and it doesn't really matter if they live or die or whatever. And that's basically what happened. That westward movement, and that's what Manifest Destiny was about. Manifest Destiny was the stated manifest destiny of the white settlers to use all the land, to take the land and make it economically viable, whether that was, farms or whatever. So can you see the different ideologies to the Native Americans? And at the end of the class, I'm going to read you Chief Seattle's speech and put it up for you, and you will get a real strong feeling about what it was about. It was sacred. It was a community. You took what you needed, but only what you needed for the most part. There were some exceptions to that, of course, but you shared, right? You never turned away someone if they needed something. And that's pretty common among all indigenous cultures across the world. So that's how the idealists say you need to begin. But they agree with the materialists that you need to have the laws and the rules and that type of thing. And so we come to the blind elephant story. I'm sure you've heard this story. The three blind men. And they give them an elephant. And they say to each one, okay, the blind men are feeling the elephant. What does an elephant look like? The blind man who has the tail says, oh, it's like a snake. The blind man that's touching the legs say, oh, it's like a tree trunk. The blind man that's touching, and this is all an ancient story, so it's man and blind, and I know they're not the terminology we would use today. And then the one that's touching the ear says, oh, it's like a big leaf. Okay. Are any of those what an elephant is? No, they're parts, but they're not the whole. Okay. So for the materialist would say those people are extremely misinformed because they're only looking, they can't see how the separate parts make a whole. And what the idealist would say is, yeah, you can be sighted and still be ideologically blind. Now, isn't that a powerful statement and a powerful way of thinking about this? You can, and the blind and sighted is only a metaphor, of course. So we all have our ideological blindnesses from the idealist perspective. And even sighted people, even people who are pretty alert, can't see the whole picture because the truth of the world is elusive, as your text puts it. It's a kind of a beautiful statement. So what is this dialogue we've been talking, this ecological dialogue? In reality, as we've said, the material and the ideal interact very closely with one another in many ways. Because what we believe, this is important, what we believe depends on what we see and feel, and what we see and feel depends on what we believe and therefore do. Let me give you a very powerful example of that. Years ago, they did a study, sociologists did a study, and what they did was they set up a mugging in a subway system in New York City. This was many, 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 many years ago. I don't know if you can still find the research or not, actually. And they showed, it was very brief, a very, a few, maybe a few seconds, I don't know, video, um, of somebody mugging somebody in a subway. Okay. And then they showed it to people and asked them what they saw. And most people saw a black man mugging somebody. Guess what? It wasn't a black man, it was a white man. Once again, let me read this again. What we believe depends on what we see, okay? That's true. And depends on what we see and feel. But what we see and feel depends on what we believe and therefore do or act upon. Okay? So it's not a matter of either or, but of both together. So this ecological dialogue that we've been talking about, the materialists and the idealists and that type of thing, the practical and the material, etc., it's a way to conceptualize power because it's this back and forth. But it's, as you know, it's not necessarily a happy or respectful dialogue. We tend to think of dialogue as being, oh, isn't that nice? They're talking about something. Well, yeah, sometimes it's not a very pleasant discussion, and that's really true in this environmental debate. So very often there's conflict involved, and there's and as they point out, conflict is not necessarily a bad thing. It's sometimes what we need in order to pay attention to have some conflict. We've had lots of examples of that lately, haven't we? Hey, wake up to what's going on, because, and I'm sure, once again, the thing in Ukraine is another example of that. For everybody in Europe is kind of waking up, and particularly in Poland, and going, oh, wow, we thought this kind of behavior and this possibility was over with the Second World War, and apparently it's not. So conflict can wake us up. And power's not necessarily a bad thing either. As your book points out, imagine what it would be like to be powerless in your life, in your own life. And there's a lot of research on that, if you want to look it up, about the mental health consequences of being powerless or feeling powerless. So before we leave this section, I want you to, there's a yin yang diagram, sort of, a rejiggered one in your book at this point. It's figure 1.1. It's the first figure. The yin and yang, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's black curved on one side, white curved on the other. The key point here is that in the black side, there's a circle of white, and in the white side, there's a circle of black. So what they're showing you with how this dialogue for environmental justice could, and from the textbooks authors should happen, is that diagram that they've made that's got the ideal on one side of the circle, the material on the other side, right? And then in the middle is practice. So you combine the ideal with the material, and you'll notice there's a little drop of material in the ideal, and then there's a little drop of ideal in the material in that diagram. But then when those come together, what you get in the middle is what you do, the practice of what you do. So now we're going to look at the dialogue of environmental justice. And this is, talking about fairness for human and non-human entities. Okay. So there's one of the things we think about is, well, equal distribution would make things fair. And the first thing they point out is there's nothing fair about equal distribution if what's being distributed is something awful, is poison or cancer causing or a variety of other things. So then what you get is the equal distribution of harm, which we all face. We all have, bad molecules of bad chemicals in our system. And we know that in breast milk, for example. It's so sad. So now let's look at transformative justice. Transformative justice, transform means to change, right, is defining gaps in the aid or the help that comes to people in 3 ways. So you look at, these are where gaps can happen in trying to make changes or help people or give aid to people. The first one is across time. Those are called issues of sustainability. I'm sure that you've heard that terminology a lot. In the first lecture from the geography class, I talked about sustainability in relation to forests and logging. So the first one is across time, issues of sustainability. The second is across social space, and that is referring to environmental justice in our social lives. We talked about, well, we haven't gotten there yet, I guess, but you'll see now we're going to move into environmental justice in a moment, and you'll see what that refers to. And then the third one is across species. Once again, think about that, okay? So I love this. That is understood by what humans as ecological beauty, what we cherish, what we do not. That's across species, okay? And that's a quote from another environmental researcher that's in that part of the text. So environmental across species refers to the beauty of the whole. Okay. So let's look at environmental justice across time. I put up so you understand something about this justice. If you don't know who Greta Thunberg is, you can Google her, but watch the video I put up of her speech. You probably know, I think everybody knows who she is. She was only 15 when she made that speech to the United Nations that I put up for you. There's a lot more online of her, and she's 18 now. If you want, you can see more about her online, but listen to that and see. Here's a quote from her. It was from that speech. You'll hear it when you look at the clip. "You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes." That was part of her message to the UN. So the key here is we're usually pretty good about planning for the immediate future. Where are we going to have lunch? Who's going to take the kids to school tomorrow? That type of thing. That we can do. But when you start thinking about long-term planning, it gets a lot more difficult. Now, Native Americans had a saying that you didn't do anything without thinking 7 generations down the line. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine thinking about the consequences for 7 generations down? That's why there's actually a environmentally sound cleaning products company that's called Seventh Generation, and that's why, in case you wondered, it doesn't have any scents in it or that type of thing. So that's long-term planning is difficult, right? And we're not very good at that because it involves a precautionary approach. You have to think about all possible outcomes and how you're going to prevent something that you don't want to happen maybe 2 or 3 years down the road, let's say, just in your personal life, right? That makes it difficult. You have to be watching for what they call the environmental yellow lights. And in your own life, you have to do that. Well, if I do this, yeah, but can I finish school or that type of thing? It's a long haul, and you have to be able to imagine or conceptualize what consequences might be for different actions. Now I'm going to skip all those sections about the specific, environmental problems, because I'm already going to probably have to do a little bit of a second video here. I hope not, but it wouldn't be more than 10 or 15 minutes if I do. So I'm skipping all of that. I want you to look at it. It's all about, there's a section on global climate change, energy and fossil fuels, non-fossil energy sources, threats to land and water, the ozone hole, 2 kinds of smog is a heading. So be sure and pay attention to the graphs and charts in that section. Now, we're moving on to the latter part of this chapter, the environmental justice across social space issue part, okay? And they begin with Reserve, Louisiana, okay? And I'm just going to briefly go over these, but you can read it in more detail in the text. So, Reserve is the name of the town. Reserve, Louisiana has a risk of cancer that is 50 times higher than the national average. It's the highest cancer risk in the United States. And if you read the story about Mary in there and all of her friends and family, you'll see. Well, what do you think might be different about Reserve Louisiana? Well, for one thing, it's working class and primarily black. Okay, town. Okay, now you're going to see how this all interrelates here. So, why? Why does Reserve Louisiana have the highest cancer rate in the United States by many times over? Okay. Well, it's very hard to find direct causal connections for cancer and environmental hazards because the individual molecules are tiny, as they explain in your book, and so it's very hard to specifically say this causes that. Okay, from a under the microscope perspective, in terms of environmental issues, it isn't in terms of viruses and infections, that type of thing. Okay. So you look at some of the other examples here, the Pontchartrain Works, the Dow chemical plant in 1968, that the stacks released more than 50 toxic chemicals, and chloroprene was the most dangerous at that point. There's no way to track a molecule of chloroprene in the lungs, muscles, and tissues. Now, lawyers could argue the case, right? And let's go back to Reserve Louisiana. Lawyers could argue the case, but people can't afford lawyers in Reserve, Alabama. And plus, that plant that is now owned by the Japanese. So who are you going to sue? The original owners? The Japanese? You get it. I really want you to watch the film Erin Brockovich. It is a must for this class. I would put it up, but I'm sure it's on YouTube. It's a full-length movie. I'll try and find a clip to put up for you this week, but you really should watch the whole movie because it's a true story. Julia Roberts plays Erin Brockovich, who's a real person. And what she and the law firm she wound up with, and she was a working class woman. She was not a lawyer or anything. You'll see how it all turned out. How she became involved in this when you watch the film. They fought against the Energy Corporation, which is Pacific Gas and Electric, PG&E, regarding its culpability in the Hinkley groundwater contamination in Hinkley, a town of Hinkley in Southern California. It's one of the best and most humorous, believe it or not, there are very humorous moments in it, and moving films. And it's true. It's a true story. And Julia Roberts does a great job as Erin Brockovich. So what Reserve Louisiana reflects is a pretty common pattern, which is those with the least power receive the most pollution. So inequality reflects another of the three central issues of environmental justice, which are social. They're not just physical space because those disparities go across many differences in social power. Okay. Heritage. So gender, sexuality, class, age, okay, are very commonly areas of less power and bad environmental outcomes and that type of thing. And then physical space is the other one. Those first two, not having any power about, you can't afford to live in a place that isn't hazardous or isn't safe or has a real grocery store. You're black, you're a woman, you're not binary, sexuality, your social class, once again, you're very poor, your age, you can't do anything about it because you're a child, etc. Those have a lot to do also with what your experience is going to be in terms of safer and cleaner environments, better food, that type of thing. And then certainly where you live. Physical space is one of the things that really reflects the difference, which you see in the Reserve Louisiana example, the Flint, Michigan, to bring one more up to date, a primarily black community with poison water pipes for years and years and years, all those children. with Hinckley in Southern California. You'll see what it's like if you see the movie. The just kind of out in the desert, poor people. So inequalities in environmental justice are found in the distribution of environmental costs, which are the bads, and the environmental benefits, which are called the goods. Okay, who gets the bads? Well, I think you guessed from what we just talked about. And so there's a term called environmental racism that comes out of the environmental justice movement. And so that's an aspect of this. So the bads are things like hazardous wastes. People of color are more likely to live in areas with hazardous waste problems. And we know that from zip code studies. Okay, Black people, other people of color, 2 to 3 times more likely to live in areas with commercial hazardous waste or landfills. In a 1992 study, 3% of all white people and 11% of all white people and 11% of people in color in Detroit live within 1 mile of hazardous waste facilities. It's almost 4 times more people of color living in hazardous, within a mile of hazardous waste facilities. Okay, so it was those types of findings that they were beginning of the environmental justice movement. The differences are more than racial, social class. You can be white and very poor and have very much the same experience, right? So social class, there's a big dispute in sociology and social sciences right now about which is more important in terms of these kind of negative outcomes. But in many cases, it's kind of close. It depends on where you are. But race and social class really predict who gets the bad in many cases. And so social class has to do with your access to what's called wealth, power, and prestige. And we're going to talk about income and wealth in a minute, so you'll see how that fits in. So another aspect is the country you live in, rich or poor. You might imagine, and you would be correct, that poor countries get the bads a lot more. So wealthy nations pay poor nations to take their hazardous waste. As you know, there's a story about Italy and the mafia in this section, and a huge cancer outbreak in the town in Italy where the mafia was taking hazardous waste to dump it from a richer country. And then the other thing is that much of what's done is legal. See where you need the institutional and political aspect here to make things illegal, because as it is, much of these horrible practices are perfectly legal. Most companies in most countries, wealthy countries, you can relocate your hazardous waste to poorer countries. Okay, so and much of that is reused or there's hazardous waste also being produced more likely in textiles, toys, electronic factories of China, which pollutes the land and the water, the sweatshops of Southeast Asia, etc. And so this what your book refers to as the growing placelessness of the marketplace, is a very powerful component of this. Okay, it really is. It contributes to this feedback loop. Do you ever look when you're at the grocery store where your fruits and vegetables come from? You know, uh, Many of them come from Mexico. Well, we banned DDT in the United States years ago, but we sell DDT to Mexico, which they then spray on crops. So unless you're buying organic produce, now there is organic produce raised in Mexico, but why not buy local organic produce? So there has been kind of a movement it's that placelessness of the market. You don't know who's producing anything, whether it's clothes or food, right? That has led to the renaissance, in a sense, of farm to table restaurants, listing the origins of their food, of farmers markets, of crafts fairs, of that type of thing. So those are the bads. Who gets the goods? Well, there's a huge inequality in average income, of course, in the wealthy countries. Let's look at income inequality quickly. The average income across the world this is the average income for every person across the world, 11,000 $98 annually. In the 10 wealthiest countries, it's $70,440. Now remember that 11,000 is much lower in the poorest countries, right? As you'll see in just a minute. Because an average is an average. It's not, you really can't tell a lot from certain averages. The cost of living, of course, is higher. We all acknowledge that in the richer countries, but it still doesn't compare to the poor. Because if you look at the poorest country, Burundi, for example, there's 10.5 million people in Burundi. The average per capita income per year is $280, which is 77 cents per day. So another aspect of this, that if people are wondering, feeling these economic pressures in the United States, is that they're true, they're real. We used to be the most egalitarian or equal economically country of all the industrialized nations, you know, a while ago. But in the 1920s, but it's a reversal now where we are much more stratified than European countries, because some of the top billionaires in the world are Americans. So that you'll see that in a minute, how that makes a problem. I hate to have you watch 4 videos this week, but I'm going to stop this now. It's at about 51 minutes, and there's probably about 10 or 15 minutes left of this, and I don't want to run out of space, because then I'm messed up for doing anything, I'd have to redo the whole thing. So I'll quit now. We'll start with a second shorter video. I apologize again. There'll never be this much video of me in any future weeks.